Welcome. Today I'm going to talk about the printing press, and I'm going to start with the story of a media revolution and a religious revolution as well. After months or years of simmering discontent, a new form of media gives opponents of an authoritarian regime a way to express their views, register their solidarity, and coordinate their actions. The protesters' message spreads virally through social networks, making it impossible to suppress and highlighting the extent of public support for revolution. This could be a description of what happened in the Arab Spring throughout the Middle East in 2011 with the use of Twitter and Facebook. It's also a description of what happened at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation when Martin Luther famously took his 95 Theses against the sale of indulgences, or the way I put it is the get out of purgatory free for a fee tickets, and he nailed those to the church door at the German university town of Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517, a date that's not that hard to remember. It's Halloween, 1517. Posting a list of these theses for public disputation on the church door was not that radical in a university town. It had been happening for centuries. It's how you announced a debate at a university. And Luther's list was written in Latin, so his audience was an academic, theological one. We're not even sure if he posted it at all on the church door. It's never been proven and is never mentioned by any eyewitness sources. We do know that Luther on that day sent handwritten copies to his superiors in the church, the Archbishop of Mainz and the Bishop of Brandenburg. He also sent copies to his friends throughout the region to spark a larger discussion. Also not uncommon. His friends thought Luther's theses were important. Others began to copy them, and then something new happened. Within a month, printed editions of the 95 Theses appeared simultaneously from local printing presses in Leipzig, Nuremberg, and Basel, Switzerland, paid for by Luther's friends. Within another month, the Latin had been translated into German, printed, and further disseminated. More presses, some outside Germany, started printing the 95 Theses, prompting Luther's friend Friedrich Myconius later to write that, quote, hardly 14 days had passed when these propositions were known throughout Germany, and within 4 weeks, almost all of Christendom was familiar with them, unquote. Luther himself seems to have been taken by surprise at his new widespread fame. In March, he writes to a friend and publisher in Nuremberg, quote, they are printed and circulated far beyond my expectation. I would have spoken far differently and more distinctly had I known what was going to happen. Luther was a quick learner, though. And later that month, he sent the publisher something new, a sermon on indulgences and grace. This time it was in German, and he even avoided regional dialect, so the words would be immediately understandable to all German speakers, from the northern coastal cities like Hamburg all the way south to Switzerland and Austria, where they speak something really radically different. Also note that Luther wrote a sermon, perhaps to be read aloud, so that folks who couldn't read might also get his message. The pamphlet of the sermon was an even bigger hit. That's it right there. A stream of publications followed. The Roman Church fired back. Luther was censored and then excommunicated. He refused to recant at the Diet of Worms in 1521, and the German Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, issued an edict banning his writings and ordering his arrest. Luther, however, had friends of his own in high places. He escaped the Diet of Worms and found protection from the church authorities and the German emperor with the help of his noble patron, Frederick III, the Elector of Saxony, who hid him in Wartburg Castle. There, he began his biggest publishing project yet, a full German translation of the Bible. For his translation, Luther used the new and sensational, quite controversial, new edition of the original Greek text, edited and published by Erasmus of Rotterdam in 1516. This was the first ever printed and published edition of the New Testament in Greek. The Latin Bible, called the Vulgate, was the official Bible of the Western Church, the Roman Church. It was the work primarily of St. Jerome, who completed it around 405 CE. According to the Church, there was no need to revisit the original Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic sources of the Bible because Jerome had been divinely inspired in creating his Latin edition. Erasmus, however, felt that Jerome had relied on some faulty manuscripts and had mistranslated some of the Greek. So he created an alternate, what he thought was more scholarly, bilingual New Testament, with the original Greek on the left, which you can't see very well, next to a new translation into the Latin on the right. The educated Latin reading and Latin speaking world of Europe was fully abuzz over Erasmus's New Testament. In the previous century, the Renaissance in Italy had recovered many ancient Greek texts, such as Plato and Thucydides, and translated those texts into Latin. Erasmus was a humanist, interested in recovering and recreating the ancient past through philology, the rigorous study of languages and their history, so that ancient texts could be reconstructed and dated accurately. He was also a pious Christian, and so his humanism prompted him to recover the ancient church and its texts using that same philology. Luther's German New Testament was done and published in September of 1522. It didn't take him very long. The complete German Bible was published in 1534, including the Old Testament and the Apocrypha. It included several full-page images, such as this one here, woodcuts for illustration. So here we have the woodcut by Lucas Cranach, a famous German painter and also wood engraver, and it represents the Apocalypse, or Revelations, book 17. And this is when the whore of Babylon rides in on a apocalyptic beast with 7 heads. That's the whore of Babylon sitting there. And this is from the December printed edition of December 1522 of the New Testament. Now, just to give you an idea, you can see what she has on her head there. And this is from 2 months earlier, the original first edition of Luther's New Testament. Now notice that her hat looks different. That's a papal tiara. Okay, it has three things on it. That makes it a papal symbol. And by September, when this came out, Lucas Cranach had done this engraving. By December, the Reformation honchos had decided that that was a little bit too much. That they didn't really want to go that far. So they took the papal tiara off the head of the whore of Babylon, and they cut it down to just one crown. Okay. Martin Luther, he took the desire to recover the ancient church and turned it into a reform movement. By translating the Bible into the vernacular, the German, he brought the Bible to the people and undermined the authority of the Roman Church. The medieval church had absorbed many reform movements, St. Francis, for instance, and the Franciscans, but Luther's reform movement was different. It had the printing press, and it was very difficult for the Roman Church to fully control the printing press, despite very good attempts. So, the Englishman, William Tyndale, acquired a copy of Luther's New Testament in 1522, was inspired, and set about writing an English language version, also using Erasmus's New Testament, his New Testament. He moved to Germany and got his New Testament to press in the town of Worms in 1526. And here we have the very beginning of the Gospel of St. John. He was still working on the Old Testament when he was arrested in 1535 outside Brussels in Belgium and executed by strangulation for treason. The Great Bible of 1539 was actually authorized by Henry VIII of England, who became a Protestant. And it became the first official Protestant Bible in England and was based heavily on Tyndale's work. And the King James Version, which is probably the most familiar, became the authoritative Bible of the Anglican Church in 1611. So, let's back up a minute. So who invented this printing press, and where, and why? Most of you may know the answer to this question, and it's not really a trick question. And the simple answer is Johannes Gutenberg, sometime in the early 1450s. So we're talking about 70 years before Luther. It was in the town of Mainz in Germany, and he was the first to print using movable type and a single pull press. Now, this is where things get a bit weird. We don't know exactly how Gutenberg made his printing press. We don't have any descriptions or illustrations of his press. In fact, We don't have an illustration of any printing press before this one, from a Danse Macabre woodcut published in Lyon, France in 1499. That's a dance of death. And what's happening here is that death comes for everyone, and here is Death and his minions coming into the print shop. And you can see the printing press is in the middle, the typographer's tray is on the left. He's getting the letters and putting them on the tray. And in the back is the bookseller. So you can see how that looked. But that's 1499, which is a good almost 50 years after Gutenberg. So no printing presses from the birth of printing have survived. Why is all this? Well, it was a very secretive technology. And experts are still trying to reverse engineer Gutenberg's method based on the output, the books themselves. So what did he print? We probably have heard of the Gutenberg Bible. The Gutenberg Bible was the first big book that was published and appeared in 1455. But we believe that several undated smaller materials appeared a bit earlier, probably around 1450 to 1452, but there are no dates. And these included, believe it or not, indulgences. Indulgences, those things that Luther was railing about. They were certificates of escape from purgatory that you could buy. And you could have a certificate of an indulgence. And this is one of those that we think came from Gutenberg's press. It's a one-page thing. And so we think that that was around 1450, 1452. And most scholars also believe that he published a Latin grammar textbook for schools by the 4th century Latin writer Donatus. And that's a page from the Donatus grammar. And we think that's also from Gutenberg's press. So what we have here is a religious context and a school context, school books and indulgences. So when the papal legate to the Holy Roman Emperor by the name of Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, an Italian, who later became Pope Pius II, came to the Frankfurt Trade Fair in October of 1454, he reported back to a Spanish cardinal that he had seen squires, which are separate pages, of a Bible presented by a miraculous man. And it had letters so large and clear, quote, you could read them without your glasses. What a remarkable thing. He also reported that there were about 180 copies and that they were all already spoken for. So this was, he had sold all the copies before he had made them, and this was a problem. Gutenberg lost his shirt in this process, and he lost to a venture capitalist, and the venture capitalist took over all of his printing stuff afterwards, but at least he got the Bible done. And what a Bible it is. So it's amazing that the first known printed book is also one of the most beautiful things that has ever rolled off of our printing press. And this is it. And I'm going to take it. This is from a J.P. Morgan example. There are probably a little less than 50 of these left in the world. And they're 1,200 pages if they're complete, usually bound in 2 volumes. And as you can see, we can talk about this a bit later. But they're, it's pretty amazing. I want to show you it a little bit closer up. So I'm going to go in and show you. This is from the Morgan's website. And I don't know if you can read that or not. Probably not. That's an eye. This big eye is in green, and it goes all the way down the side of the page. And it says, in principio creavit Deus caelum et terram, which means in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Okay? And so there we have it. That's one page from a Gutenberg Bible. And now the question happens as to how did he actually do it? And I'm going to show you something from the University of Texas. The University of Texas is the last place to have bought a full Gutenberg Bible, which they did in 1978, and they only paid $2.4 million for it, which, as we'll find out a little bit later, is an incredible bargain. But they have a huge website on their page about the Gutenberg Bible, of which they should be quite happy. And this is their little video about how it was put together, their estimation of how it was put together. So I'm going to show you.
A character is produced as follows. On the end of a metal rod, a mirror image of the letter is engraved. This is then pushed into softened copper, producing a pit in the shape of the letter. This matrix, as it's called, acts as the mould for the actual type, which is cast from lead. In order to manufacture the many letters needed quickly and in sufficient quantity, Gutenberg took another important step forward, inventing the hand-casting instrument. It consists of a rectangular channel. The matrix is inserted at one end and molten lead poured into the other. When the instrument is opened, a letter cast in lead is there ready to be used. As the matrix is reusable, an unlimited number of identical letters can be cast. Finally, the typesetter can begin to combine the letters into lines. In the form, the lines or columns are combined to create the page layout as desired. The result is a mirror image of the page to be printed. The form is now inked in with printer's ink. Gutenberg used a mixture of lampblack varnish and egg white. Printing can now start. Gutenberg used a special press for this purpose, but he derived the principle from the traditional wine press. Gutenberg's first printed works were official documents, papal decrees, and grammars. But soon he started on a mammoth venture, the Latin Bible. For this project he cast more than 100,000 pieces of type. For more than 2 years, Gutenberg's typesetters and printers worked on the first edition of 180 copies. The text was printed in black letter or Gothic type, based on the handwriting of the day. Finally, the illuminator added the coloured initials and drawings. With his Bible, one of the world's most beautiful printed books, Gutenberg proved that a work printed with movable type could be as aesthetically pleasing as one written by hand.
Okay. So, that gives us a little idea about the text of the Gutenberg Bible. But it leaves a few questions. So, what about the paper that he used? All right, so here things get a little more interesting. The Chinese invented paper sometime around the 2nd century CE. And paper came to be used almost exclusively in China for books after the 5th century CE. Paper arrived in the West around 1150 CE, but it didn't prove popular until much later. So parchment, or vellum, made from calf skins, was much more durable, and written works meant to last used vellum. Gutenberg printed probably about 30 of the Bibles on vellum, with the rest being on paper. Paper was a lot cheaper, and each Bible was printed on about 1,200 pages. It would have taken the skins of 140 calves to produce one Bible. So, another problem with vellum that became clear after the invention of printing, the printing press, was that it was difficult to get it to lie completely flat, which was really important in the printing press. So paper was much more flexible, it was thinner, it didn't bunch up and cause the ink to well, and of course it was cheaper. So what about the type? So each page needed about 2,600 individual pieces of type that had to be typeset on the form, as it mentioned, in a mirror image. He needed about 300 sorts of types or characters, including uppercase and lowercase letters, punctuation, special characters, and common abbreviations. Did the type-making technology also come from the East? We don't know for sure, but experts are skeptical. What we do know is that movable type had been invented in China around 1050 CE using ceramic tablets. The first metallic types were invented in the Goryeo dynasty in Korea around 1377, which is about 80 years before Gutenberg. Here we have, from 1377, the first example of a metallic type from the Korean Jikji, the Selected Teachings of Buddhist Sages and Seon Masters. It's the world's oldest extant book printed in movable type, metal type. But they didn't use a press. They rubbed paper over the type molds. Okay, so that's not the exact same invention. Gutenberg created type pieces using an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony, which are the same components used still today in various quantities. So what about woodblock printing? Well, woodblock printing is also quite old, and it goes back to China. And here we have in 868 CE, the Diamond Sutra from the Tang Dynasty. All right, this is a woodblock printing. In the West, woodblock printing was dominated by the production of playing cards. People used playing cards, and they had woodblocks for those playing cards, and also for images of saints sold by churches to the devout, often to pilgrims. And Gutenberg was intimately familiar with both of these, with this world of woodblock printing. He may have been involved in some playing cards before he took on the printing press. So just because we're talking about books for reading, let's not forget that woodcuts in the early printing age, as they allowed for a new form of visual art, mechanically reproduced and distributable cheaply to thousands of folks, including many who could not read. Also, woodcuts and other engravings bridged the gap between the literate and those who could not read. I want to show you just a bit here about Albrecht Dürer, who is my favorite wood engraver. Just predates the Reformation a bit. And this also brings up a new kind of art. What we have here is Albrecht Dürer's woodcut, which would be sold separately as an individual sheet from 1514. All right, and this is Melancholia 1, and here's another Dürer woodcut of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse from around 1498. Now notice down at the bottom, you can see his little signature, the AD, Albrecht Dürer. And this is one of the first times that someone comes up with their own branding mark. It's a trademark that says, this is an Albrecht Dürer print. And he was quite the entrepreneur. So this is a moment when artists begin to realize that because of the printing press and the woodblock technology and the engraving, that they can create works that they can make multiple copies of and sell. All right, so that's new. And also that this begins to speak to people visually in a way that is beyond the literacy. And here's another one of Dürer's, one of my favorites, the rhinoceros. I don't know the story behind the rhinoceros. I suspect he didn't have an actual rhinoceros to do this from, but it's pretty impressive. From 1515, you can see the AD up at the top again. Also, it's also kind of a pun because it's near the date always, and Anno Domini AD, the date 1515 AD, but Albrecht Dürer as well. All right. So I also want to show you the way in which the printing press and woodcuts particularly spoke to. They spoke to simple folk, as is often referred to in a famous book about this. People who couldn't read could still get the propaganda of the Reformation, and they would get it through visual images. And particularly, Luther was really good at this. And this is from a very small pamphlet that Luther had printed in 1523 about two very unusual, monstrous births that had happened. One being the so-called Pope Ass at Rome. In Rome, in the Tiber River, appeared a dead donkey that had very strange features. It was clearly a monstrous birth that had died at birth. All right, but it had kind of the body of had a torso that looked kind of like a human being, and it had scales like a fish, and a few other things that were portrayed. And since it showed up in the Tiber, Luther, this was a monstrous birth, and it was interpreted by Luther as a sign from God that there was an abomination, that there was a monster sitting in Rome who had taken over the church, an antichrist, and he was the Pope. So this became a symbol for God's wrath at what had happened in Rome and in the need of reform, and it was the Pope ass. And on the next page is this thing called the monk calf, and there was a monstrous birth of a calf that looked a bit like a monk. And Luther and the Protestants were very much against monasteries and monks. So they thought, and having been one himself, Luther had been a monk, he felt like he knew what he was talking about. Notice that this thing has a cowl on its back, which is a sign of a monk, and it has two very stunted little horns at the top. And the horns were the sign of the gospel. So the fact that the horns were stunted, had been chopped off in a way by God in some way, meant that these guys really didn't have much gospel in them. All right? So there's a whole pamphlet that goes through and describes every little detail about the splotchy skin and where it came from and what it means. And this was very common. Monstrous births, special signs from God. There would be strange comets, or the sky would rain fire. And Protestants and Catholics both were very keen on interpreting those as signs of the end times. The apocalypse was coming, and you better be on the right side of this religious divide, was what it came down to. So how did the printing press change the world? Well, in several ways, and I'll just give you a couple of ideas here. First off is print shop culture. The print shop was a new space where lots of different kinds of people had to come together in order to produce a book. So you'd find former priests and abbots and university professors serving as editors and correctors, and they had to be in the printing press room. They had to read the sheets as they came off and make corrections before they wasted a lot of material. So they were there. Also, these folks came into close contact with metal workers and mechanics. And astronomers were there with engravers, physicians and painters together, dissolving older divisions of intellectual labor and encouraging new ways of coordinating the work of brains, eyes, and hands. Second, with the printing press, culture could be transmitted through space at a distance, much more cheaply and efficiently. The reading public was also more atomistic and individualistic than a hearing one. Insofar as a traditional sense of community entailed frequent gathering together to receive a given message, this sense was probably weakened by the duplication of identical messages, which brought the solitary reader, the reader in solitary, to the fore. Now, I want to make sure that we understand that there weren't a ton of readers out there at this time. At the beginning of the Reformation, estimates vary, but we think that in Germany, probably no more than 5% of the population could actually read. So we are talking about the readers being a pretty small group, but it increases dramatically over the next few years. All right? To be sure, bookshops, coffee houses, reading rooms in libraries provided new kinds of communal gathering places. Subscription lists where you could subscribe to what became journals, and corresponding societies represented relatively impersonal group formations, while the reception of printed messages in any place still required some temporary isolation where you sat by yourself and you read, just as it happens today in a library reading room outside there. Now, while communal solidarity may have diminished, vicarious participation in more distant events was also enhanced. And even while local ties may have been loosened, links to larger collective units were being forged. As Columbus and others were exploring new worlds, and as humanists and antiquarians were unearthing ancient texts and artifacts, their reports could reach folks everywhere books circulated. The world got a lot smaller because of the printing press. Also, technical literature goes to the press. Scientific societies could publish their findings, and experiments could be reproduced, just as the text describing them were. So here's a map you can't see very well, but this is a map of 15th century printing towns of incunabula. And an incunabula are the books that were printed, and that's a Latin word that means from the cradle, in the cradle of printing, which means they were printed before the year 1501. So from the 1450s to 1500. And you can see where it happens. There's this massive blob in Germany, and then there's a massive blob in northern Italy, and then some scattered away. And if you could see the colors, then you would also see that it doesn't happen in London until quite late, and that the rest of British Isles don't get it for quite some time. So there really are publishing centers, and eventually it spreads abroad. So the oldest printing press in the Americas was in Mexico City in 1539. That's 100 years before the first printing press in the British colonies, or British North America. In the 16th century in Mexico City, more than 30% of locally produced imprints in Mexico were in native Indian languages, mostly religious texts and grammars or vocabularies for Amerindian languages. They had a religious mission, often by the Jesuits, to convert the Amerindian people. So they created these grammars that they could then take in, all right? And in the 17th century, it goes from 30% being in Amerindian languages all the way down to 3%. So it's a temporary thing to get everybody up to snuff in Spanish. So that's what happened. I also want to show you just the explosion that happens. At the bottom, you see 15th century. We think that probably, maybe from anywhere between 8 million and 20 million books were published in the incunabula period. All right? Note what happens here. We got over 200 million in the 16th century. Jumps to over 500 million in the 17th century. We got about 1 billion in the 18th century. So things kind of take off. And I want to end with the oldest book published in British America, which is the Bay Psalm Book, printed in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1640. Now, I've got 2 pages here. This is from a recent New York Times article. One, you can see the type. It's a fairly primitive typeface, actually. But, of course, you can read this a little better than the Gutenberg Bible. And notice at the top there on the right is Hebrew. There are some Hebrew letters in this psalm book. It makes sense. It's the Psalms. All right? But what are those Hebrew letters? And we think that those were actually woodcuts, wood block, because they didn't have the Hebrew typeface. So they would print that a little bit separately from the actual. They would leave a space, and they would print each page twice. Once with the typeface of the regular letters, and then they'd come back and stamp or engrave in the Hebrew. And on the last page, I wanted you to get a look at Psalm 23. This begins down at the bottom. A Psalm of 23, a Psalm of David. And it reads, "The Lord to me a shepherd is, want therefore shall not I. He in the folds of tender grass doth cause me down to lie." All right? Now, the reason that I bring this up is that this is not the King James Version of the Bible. The people who came to Massachusetts did not want to have anything to do with the King James Version of the Bible, because that was the official Bible of the Anglican Church from which they were leaving. Okay? So they did their own thing. Now, this particular text didn't last very long. It was kind of clunky. It was not great poetry. But it recently sold. There are only 11 extant copies of the 1640 Bay Psalm book. And one of them was recently sold by the Old South Church, who had 2 copies of this book. They sold a copy of this book, and it became the highest price ever paid for a printed book. It went for $14 million. And that's way more than, obviously, the last Gutenberg Bible. Now, if a Gutenberg Bible were to go on the block right now, it would go for way more than that. But $14 million is pretty good for the Old South Church, which still exists and is going to use it for good things. All right, thank you.